Welcome back to this 10th video in a series where I record myself as I teach myself Python. In my previous video, I finished working on my user mapper program, and I said I was going to next create a web app using the Flask framework and reuse the user mapper code in that Flask program. After doing some reading about Flask, I decided that the best way to reuse this code in Flask is to package it as a Python package so that I can import functions from the package into my Flask program. That way I don't have to make two copies of the same code, and any changes I make to the user mapper program as part of integrating it into the Flask project can also remain part of the main user mapper project. To learn about packaging a Python program, I looked at this really good how-to document from the U of T coders. This is the document I used as the template for packaging my user mapper program. And I also read the information about packaging in the Learning Python book in chapter 24. Or if you have a similar Python book, you probably have a chapter on packaging in it. It's been a while since I worked on this project, and I've deleted it from my computer. So I need to clone the repository again. I need to get the address of the repository from GitHub. There's my user mapper repository. And I will copy the URL. Then I open up the command palette in VS Code and search for the Git Clone Command. I enter in the URL that I copied from GitHub and press return. I'm going to store this in my home directory. Yes, I would like to open the cloned repository. And there it is. I'm going to open a terminal and start a virtual environment. If I click on a Python file, the Python extension should detect that I'm trying to use Python, and it should ask me to install the Python linter. And I get that error because the wheel package is not installed. Before I start modifying the code and turning this into a package, I should tag this release and just call everything I have here currently release 0.1. And I'll push that change up to GitHub so it's stored there also. And I need to use the git push follow tags option. And it looks like I had a problem signing into GitHub. So I'll try that again. And it looked like that worked. I can see that on GitHub just by checking out my repository. There, I have one tag named v0.1. To convert a set of Python modules into a package, create a new package directory inside the project directory. I'll use the user mapper directory name again, then move the important project files into the package. Readme, test, and sample files can remain outside of it. And then create a new blank file named _init_.py. And then, just like in a normal Python module, where you would have the if name equals _main_, I need, because this is a package, and things are operating at a higher level, I actually need a module named _main _.py, which will contain the code that runs when someone runs the package. The main.py module will import functions from the other modules in the package and run them. When importing modules in a package, you also need to reference the package name, so that this needs to be from usermapper.usermapper, because it's the usermapper.py module in the usermapper folder, or I can use a relative import and simply just start the usermapper module's name with a period. And I could just take the same code from the usermapper.py module and put it in main. Or I might say that's the wrong way to go. I still want to keep this code in the usermapper.py program, and I don't want to have duplicate code in my project. So I'm going to make this code into a function in the usermapper.py program, and then I'm going to call that function from the main.py program. And I have a couple of errors in this program. I should see what those are. Unable to import mapper data, unable to import YAML. Okay, so there's two problems there. Number one, I didn't install PyYAML in this virtual environment. And in the other case, mapper data, I need to change the import statement so it knows where to look for that module. And again, I either need to reference the package folder or I need to use a relative import. So the relative import solves error number one, and then installing PyYAML solves error number two. Now that I have created a function called main in the usermapper.py module, I'm going to import that function into the main.py package program and then call it. When I run the package, the main.py program is the program that runs. It will import the main function from the usermapper.py program and run the code in the main function, which then runs all the other functions in the other modules and generates the result I expect to see. So let's test that out. I'm already in my project folder, and since this is a package, I just have to call the package name, and the package name is usermapper. And I have to use the -m just so that Python knows where to find the module in its search path. And it seems to have run. You can see a new file was created, usermapping.xml, and it looks exactly the way I would expect. I now have a package. In order to distribute this package, I have to create another file called setup, which will tell Python how to install this package on someone else's system. The information about the setup.py file is in this nice how-to from the University of Toronto Coders that I referenced at the start of this video. I pretty much used this as a template. There's also more details about using the setup.py file and Python setup tools in general in the Python documentation. The setup.py file is in the project folder. You don't put it right in the package folder, so it's at the next level above the package folder. So I'll just create a new file in this project folder and call it setup.py. So this runs a Python program called setup, which is part of the setup tools library in the standard Python library. And then you run the imported setup function with a bunch of parameters. And I chose these parameters because they're the same parameters that the University of Toronto Python users group used in their example. If you look at the Python documentation, there are a lot of other parameters that you could use. One main point here is the version is 0.2, but I haven't tagged my repository as 0.2 yet, so I am going to do that. And I've also realized that I didn't create a new branch for this project, and I should have. So when I make some changes in the next example, I'm definitely going to follow the Git best practices. For now, I will check this into the master branch on Git, push it to GitHub, and then tag it to version 0.2. I want to test that I can install this package just like any other user will. So I'm going to create a new folder and a new virtual environment and install the user mapper package into it and then try to use it. The user mapper program is hard-coded to look for a file named config.yaml in the directory from which you're running the program, and I don't have that in this directory. So I'll just copy the example config file that's in the user mapper project over to this directory. And when I run the program again, it should work. There. And I should see a user mapping.xml file. I do. And it looks like the type of file that I'm expecting. I have successfully created a package named User Mapper, and I can distribute this to other people via GitHub and just tell them to install it using the Pip Install Command, and then they can use it exactly the way I have. However, I don't think it is very convenient to tell people that they have to put the config.yaml file in a particular location, or even always call it config.yaml. So I want to add some command line options or arguments to this program, which will allow a user to specify the input file and the output file. That should make this program more flexible for users. Previously, I created an issue in GitHub to describe this problem of hard-coding the config.yaml file in the program. So I will go back to the GitHub page and find the issues. And there it is. Allow user to enter the config file name. All right, so I'm going to assign this one to me. And I'll just leave a comment in progress. Now this is issue number 2. I should be able to close this issue with my commit message. Before I start working on this issue, I will create a new branch in GitHub. And I can see that VS Code automatically switches over to the new branch. And now I can start modifying the code. There are many ways to convert a Python script into a command line program. Some good resources on the web about this are the Real Python article about Python command line arguments, and also the command line and environment documentation in the Python docs. I could use the sys module, the argparse library, the fire library, even ncurses. There are lots of different frameworks that I looked at, but I think that since I'm a beginner, I should just use the standard argument parsing methods provided in the Python standard library, which is the sys module and the sys.argv array or list. Most of the code I need to change will be in the main function in the usermapper.py module. First, I'm going to create some help text, which will output whenever someone tries to use the program and enters in, for example, a help option or just makes an error. I can pass out the help text. And the help text is also going to help me just plan what the command line format should look like. So this is just a variable. I'm using the triple quote option so that I can enter all of the text as if it will appear on the screen without having to worry about coding in new lines and things like that. If you want to specify the input file, you can use the -i flag, or you can use the long input option. And then you can specify the input file name. And if you want to specify the output file, you have to enter the O option or the long output option, and then specify the output file name. And then I'll just have some information about defaults. Next, we'll modify the main function so that it reads the arguments and then uses the values in those arguments to run the code you already see here in the main function. The first thing I'm going to do is define some default file names so that if you don't want to enter in any values, you can still use config.yaml and usermapping.xml as the default file names. Next, I'll do some input checking. Based on how I envision the user entering in commands, I expect only 5 arguments. I expect the name of the program, either an I or a double dash input, then the input file name, either an O or a double dash output, and the output file name. And if they choose to use defaults, they may only enter in one of these values or none of them. So I will have a check that makes sure I have 5 arguments or less. And I'm using the sys.argv array here. And essentially, it just collects everything you typed in when you ran the Python command. And it stores that as a list that you can parse through. So in this case, I'm just checking the length of the list. And if there's a problem, I'll just print the help text that I previously defined in the help text variable. And the sys module provides ways to exit the program. So if there's a problem, I'm going to exit the program using exit code 2, which, based on the reading I did, means user error. Now we'll get to the main logic of the program. First, I'll make a copy of the argument list with the program name removed. And I'll do this using Python's slice notation and assign to the list args everything from the list that's in sys.argv except for the first element. One way to work through a list of arguments is to pop each argument off of the array of arguments while you're working through a while loop. When you pop out the last argument, the argument array, args, will be empty, and so the while loop will exit. I'll test each argument to see if it's one of the flags I'm looking for. So in the first case, if the argument is -i or --input, I'll then go and get the next argument by popping the next argument off of the args array and assign that to the config file variable name. And that should be, since it came after the input variable, that should be the input file name input by the user. If the argument wasn't -i or --input, maybe it was -o or --output. If that was the case, I will pop the argument off of the next item in the arguments list and assign that to the output file variable. And I'm expecting that to be the output file name. I also have a help argument. So if the argument is -h or --help, I will print some help text. And then instead of continuing on in this while loop, I will exit the program with exit code 0, which I think just means I'm exiting for some reason other than a problem. And if I see anything else in the argument list, it's an invalid argument, something I'm not expecting, so I will just print the help text and exit with code 2, meaning user error. Having a look at the main code here, I see that after the while loop runs and gathers up all of the arguments and assigns values to the input file and output file variables, the program will run the next 4 lines where it opens the input file, processes it, and outputs a XML formatted usermapping.xml file. Since I'm not hard coding the configuration file name and the output file name anymore, I need to make some changes to these lines of code. I'll replace the hard-coded file name config.yaml with the config_file variable name. I need to specify the output file. I remember that the XML writer function has inside of it hard-coded the output file name. So I'm going to add an additional argument to the XML writer function and pass in the output file variable that contains the output file name I read in from the parameters that you entered when you run this program. So I can find the XML function using VS Code's GoToDefinition feature. That takes me straight to the function. And here I can add the output file as one of the arguments and then replace the usermapping.xml file name that's hard-coded with the output file variable. Now I think we're done, except I see that there are some errors in the usermapper.py file. I see I have 5 errors down there. If I click on that, it will tell me that they're all the same error, undefined variable sys, and that's because I did not import the sys module. And that seems to have cleaned up the errors. So let's give this a quick test. First, we always have to remember to make sure our virtual environment is activated, and then we'll just run the package. We don't have to specify the extension of the file that's in the package, the .py. We just use the package name. I think I need to use the -m flag so that Python knows where to search for the modules in its path. And that worked. So I should see a testoutput.xml file in this folder. There it is, and let's have a look at it. That pretty much looks like what I expect. Now let's see what happens when you specify a file that doesn't exist as an input file. I get an error. So I could add some code to my program to catch this, because I expect this is a pretty common problem users are going to have. So what I'll do is I will change the while loop in the usermapper.py module so that it checks that the files or the directories actually exist. I'll check that the input file exists, and I'll check that the directory that you specify for the output file actually exists. That should cover 80% of file naming issues. To check that a file or folder exists, I'm importing the OS library from the Python standard library, and I'm using the path module from the OS library. For the output file, I need to first check whether or not the user specified a directory that the output file should be saved in. And then I'll check to see that that output file directory actually exists. Now we'll just quickly test this and make sure I didn't break anything. First, I'll check to see that this can find out whether or not I've got an existing input configuration file. There, input file not found. And now I'll test to see if it can track an invalid output file directory. Their output file directory does not exist. Let's make sure all the defaults still work. So basically this works. I'll commit these changes to my Git repository. So I'll click on the source control icon, and already I see a test file that I need to get rid of. So I've just deleted it. Now I'm going to click on the usermapper.py diff file here, have a look at the changes I've made. That looks good. And I'll enter in a git commit message. and then I will commit this to Git. Oh, I didn't add it, so I'll just add it and commit it at the same time there. And then I can merge this branch with the main branch. So first things first, I check out the master branch, and then I use the Git Merge command to merge the make CLI branch with the main branch. And now I can push these changes up to GitHub by clicking on the synchronize button at the bottom of the VS Code screen. And since this is going to be a new release, I want to tag it. So I will tag it as version 0.3. Actually, first I'll just check what tags I have. Okay, I've got 0.1 and 0.2, so I will tag this as 0.3. And I'll push this to GitHub using the git push follow tags command. Now let's see what things look like on GitHub. I'll go into my user mapper repository and look at the issues. And issue number 2 is still open. That's because I didn't mention it in my commit message. And I should have done that so that I could connect the commit that I made to this issue, which helps me tell the story of the project in GitHub. One way to fix this is to put the actual commit hash into the comments of the issue. So I have to find the commit hash. So the first thing I need to do is go back to the project, go to the code, and here's the last commit that I made. There it is there. I'll just copy that link location, and I'll go to issues, issue number 2, and enter that into the comments. And that should automatically be reduced to an abbreviated link, and then I can just close the issue. Now that I've turned this program into a package that anybody can install directly from GitHub, I should update the Readme file with some installation instructions and some usage instructions. I've already prepared some Readme text, so I just copied and pasted that into the code editor on GitHub. And then I'll commit those changes. And one thing you'll notice is that the pip install command from GitHub looks kind of interesting. I got this from the pip install documentation, which tells you how to install Python programs, or Python packages, I should say, directly from Git. And it tells me how to tag a particular program with a release number. So for example, if I want to do some more work on this, people can still download and install version 3, even though I'm probably a few Git commits ahead of version 3 in the future. So let's try this out. I will copy this command. But if I was a new user and I wanted to install this program in a virtual environment that I created and run it, I would run the pip install command from my README file. Just like a new user, I'll create a new config.yaml file. I'll just paste some valid content into it for the test here. Save the file. And then I will run my user mapper program. And I should see that a usermapping.xml file has been created. And if I list the contents of that file, I should see it's a valid file. There, I've successfully installed this program from Git. So now I know this program can be distributed to other users who may find it useful. Let's review what I accomplished tonight. I reorganized my Python project into a package so that others can install it from GitHub. And I also modified my program so that users can specify the input file and the output file. And I'm doing all of this with the future in mind so that I can reuse this code when I build a Flask web app that essentially does exactly the same thing as this file, except served up from a website. So I'll create all of the code for the website in one program, and I will reuse functions from the code that I currently have written in the user mapper program so that I don't have to maintain the same code in two different places. So I'm really looking forward to getting started on Flask. I hope you'll join me in my next series where I actually implement the Flask program that I talked about. Thank you for listening.